My parents chose my brother over me again, but when they ruined my graduation day, I took a stand and changed everything. Growing up at home was never easy for me. As the younger of two siblings, it was obvious that my older brother was always the family's focal point. At 21, my parents treat him like royalty, while I often feel like just another piece of furniture, functional but unnoticed. Don't get me wrong, I don't expect to be adored, but it would have been nice to feel like I mattered, even for just one moment. A few weeks ago, I finished high school, a milestone that should have been significant. I was excited because, despite everything, my parents had promised to throw me a small party. I didn't want anything over the top, just a simple get-together with my closest friends and family to mark the end of an important chapter in my life. For the first time, my mom even asked me what colors I wanted for the decorations, which made me feel hopeful, as it was the first time she showed any interest in me. But, of course, nothing in this house ever lasts long when it concerns me. A few days before my graduation, my brother came home from college. Everything seemed calm until, as usual, he stirred up trouble. He had failed one of his key classes, which meant he wouldn't be graduating on time. As soon as he entered the house, he started yelling and blaming everyone and everything. Professors, the educational system, even the weather. What stunned me, though, was how my parents reacted. Instead of confronting him like they should have, they rushed to comfort him, just as they always do. Later that night, I was in my room trying to finish a book when I overheard my parents arguing in the living room. They had gone from comforting him to searching for a quick fix for his failure. They decided to pay for private tutoring for him, even if it meant making adjustments to our budget. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but looking back, that moment marked the beginning of everything falling apart. The next morning, I expected to find a lively atmosphere, decorations, food in the kitchen, and signs of a party being prepared. Instead, I found an eerie silence. My mom was sitting at the dining table with a list of expenses in her hand, and my dad was on the phone, apparently trying to arrange my brother's tutoring. I stood there hoping they'd at least acknowledge I was in the room, but after an awkward silence, I was the one who had to remind them, "Today's my graduation, remember?" My mom barely looked up and muttered, "Oh, right, congratulations, honey," then returned to her list as though I wasn't even there. It wasn't surprising to me anymore, so I kept quiet. I went to my room to get ready for the ceremony, trying to stay hopeful. I thought maybe they were distracted, but after the event, they would realize and things would change for the better. When it was time to leave, we got in the car, and there was nothing but silence. My dad was driving, my mom was absorbed in her phone, and my brother was complaining about something in the back seat. At least that part felt familiar. The ceremony itself was nice, but when it ended, instead of hearing something like, "We're proud of you," or "You did great," all they said was, "We're done. I have to go home and make some calls." That was it. No photo, no affection, just that. Later that night, while I was in my room, some friends messaged me asking about the party time. I got excited, thinking maybe, despite everything, there would still be a celebration. I went downstairs to ask, but what I found left me stunned. My mom was in the living room arguing with my dad about how to cancel the party without looking rude. "Can we say she got sick or something?" my mom suggested, and my dad nodded in agreement. In that moment, it felt like I had been slapped. I walked over and asked them directly, "What's going on?" My mom tried to explain, saying, "Honey, we can't afford to spend money on a party right now. Your brother needs those classes to stay on track with college. I hope you understand." The words, "I hope you understand," hit me hard, and something inside me snapped. How could everything always be about him? Were my achievements not important at all? That night, my parents sent messages to the guests, telling them the party was canceled. But they didn't tell the truth. They claimed I had suddenly gotten sick and couldn't have visitors. They didn't even ask me before making up that lie. That's when I decided I wasn't going to take it anymore. After hearing them cancel my party with such an excuse, I locked myself in my room, not to cry, but to think. My entire life had been spent in the background, always sacrificing myself. But not today. Not on such an important day for me. I wasn't going to let this slide. The next morning, I went downstairs to confront my parents. My mom was casually making breakfast, as if nothing had happened while my dad read the newspaper. My brother was glued to the TV playing video games, completely unaware. I stood before them and said, "How could you cancel my party without even asking me?" My mom didn't even glance at me as she responded, "Honey, we already explained. This. Your brother's situation is delicate, and we couldn't justify spending money on a party when he needs our focus right now." The word priority rang in my head like a hammer. It was always the same. He was the priority, and I was the inconvenience. That was the moment my patience shattered. "You know what? I don't care what he needs," I snapped. This was about me, not him. Why does everything always have to be ruined because of him? My brother, who had been silent until then, looked at me with his usual condescending attitude. Relax, it's no big deal. No one was going to miss a boring party. That comment felt like adding fuel to the fire. Boring? I yelled. It wasn't about the party. It's about how, as a family, you've never shown me even the smallest bit of support. Everything revolves around you, and I'm sick of it. My mom tried to calm me down, but I wasn't interested in her excuses. I grabbed my things and locked myself in the guest room where I could be left alone for the day. I got messages from friends asking what happened, but I didn't respond. I was still processing the anger and humiliation I felt. That night, something unexpected happened. My aunt, my dad's sister, called to ask why the party had been canceled. My mom tried to use the same excuse as before, but my aunt wasn't the type to accept vague answers. Sick? Why didn't you tell me sooner? I want to talk to her, my aunt insisted. My mom tried to avoid it, but my aunt wasn't backing down. Finally, my mom handed me the phone, looking irritated. When I spoke to my aunt, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told her everything. How my brother was always the favorite, how they canceled my party without consulting me, and how they made up a lie to cover it up. My aunt was silent for a moment, then said, "This has gone too far." I wasn't sure what she meant, but hearing that felt like a weight lifted. For the first time, someone was on my side. A few days later, my aunt came to visit. As soon as she entered, she went straight to my parents and demanded an explanation. What followed was like watching a bomb go off in our living room. "How can you treat your daughter like this?" my aunt said firmly. "Your whole lives have revolved around that boy, and now you're ruining her graduation for him." My dad tried to defend himself, saying they were doing their best, but my aunt wasn't having it. "Don't give me that," she shouted. "Do you know how many times I've had to listen to this girl cry quietly when she comes to visit me? You've neglected your daughter too long." My mom tried to intervene, but my aunt kept going. "And what about all the money I've given you to help? Was it meant to fix your mistakes or to actually raise your children properly?" That statement took me by surprise. I had no idea my aunt had been financially supporting my parents. My parents looked utterly ashamed. "Pack your things, you're coming with me," my aunt told me. When she said that, a mix of emotions flooded me. On one hand, I felt relief that someone was finally standing up for me, but on the other hand, I worried my parents would try to stop me. To my surprise, they didn't. They just stood there silently as if they knew they had no defense for their actions. I went upstairs, opened my suitcase, and began packing. As I was doing so, my mom came in behind me, trying to sound calm. "Are you really going to do this?" she asked, her voice almost pleading. "Do you understand that things aren't as simple as they seem?" "Simple?" I replied, letting out a bitter laugh. "Do you know what's not simple? Spending 18 years, feeling like a burden in my own family." She attempted to get closer, but I stepped back. I didn't want to hear her excuses or deal with her emotional manipulation. Without saying anything more, I finished packing and went downstairs. Before we left, my dad tried to say something, but my aunt cut him off with a simple, "If you really cared, you would have done something by now." And with that, we left. Living with my aunt felt like stepping into a completely new world. For the first time, I felt valued. My aunt not only gave me a safe space, but also began sharing things with me I never expected to learn. "Your parents have always been careless with money," she admitted one night over dinner. "I've been the one funding much of their lifestyle. Not because I had extra, but because I thought it was best for you. But now I see they don't appreciate any of it." That conversation marked a turning point for me. I realized that my parents hadn't just mistreated me emotionally. They had also taken advantage of my aunt's generosity. I decided it was time to take control of my life and make sure they could never use or disregard me again. With my aunt's guidance, I began exploring legal options to separate myself from them. We discovered that, due to their history of financial irresponsibility, there were ways to limit their access to certain benefits still tied to me, such as funds they had received in my name. My aunt explained that while this process could be complicated, it was necessary to protect myself. What truly shocked me, though, was what happened next. Without consulting me, my aunt organized a family meeting at her house. She invited several close relatives and shared everything: the years of favoritism towards my brother, how my parents canceled my party without even asking me, and how they had used her money to maintain their lifestyle. The reaction was immediate. Many of my uncles and cousins, who had always thought my parents were perfect, sided with me. It was like a light bulb had gone off, and suddenly everyone started questioning my parents' actions. Of course, my parents soon found out what had happened. My mom called me hysterical, accusing me of destroying the family's reputation. My dad tried to blame me too, but by then I didn't care anymore. "You did this to yourselves," I told them. I just told the truth. While all of this was unfolding, something unexpected occurred. My brother, who had always been indifferent to my struggles, showed up at my aunt's house. At first, I thought he was there to defend my parents, but what he said left me speechless. "I didn't know things were so bad for you," he said, his voice filled with regret, a tone I had never heard before. I know I've been a jerk. Although I was surprised by his sudden change of attitude, I wasn't ready to forgive him. That doesn't change anything, I said firmly. Maybe now you understand what your privileges have cost others. My brother stayed quiet, and though he seemed genuinely regretful, I knew this wasn't something that could be mended by words alone. The strain in our family reached its peak after my aunt exposed everything. My parents were entirely isolated, at least from my father's side of the family. No one wanted to associate with them. However, this didn't deter their attitude. My mom began sending me messages, accusing me of ruining the family and being ungrateful after everything they had done for me. According to her, raising and supporting me was a monumental sacrifice, something I should be eternally grateful for. Her tactics weren't new, but this time I refused to be manipulated. Meanwhile, my aunt and I continued our search for legal ways to protect myself. We discovered that some of the funds my parents had managed, specifically those they received in my name, were meant for my education. The money was supposed to be saved until I reached adulthood, but instead, my parents had used it to fund my brother's desires and maintain their own lifestyle. My aunt, who was knowledgeable about finance, helped me contact a lawyer, and we filed a formal request for my parents to account for how those funds were spent. When they received the notice, my dad's reaction was immediate and furious. He called me, yelling that I had no right to accuse them and that I was being manipulated by my aunt. Manipulated? I responded with a calmness that seemed to quiet him for a moment. Do you know what manipulation truly is? Spending my entire life making me feel invisible and less important than your favorite son? That's manipulation. After that call, I decided to block their numbers. I had no more words for them. What followed was like a family trial. Over the next few weeks, my aunt and I gathered evidence showing how they had wasted the money meant for me. My parents, for their part, tried to justify their actions by claiming they did it for the family's benefit, saying my brother needed the money more. But the lawyer my aunt hired was relentless. What hit me hardest during this time was the number of secrets that came to light. It turned out my parents had been in financial trouble long before I was born, and my aunt had been helping them out, financially, for years. Yet, they had never been responsible with the money they had. They had even mortgaged our house without telling anyone. When all of this surfaced, I was overwhelmed with a mix of anger and sadness. They hadn't just neglected my needs, they had lied and manipulated everyone around them. One of the hardest moments was confronting my brother. Though he had tried to apologize earlier, now he was forced to face the consequences of the favoritism he had enjoyed. During a meeting with the lawyer, it was revealed that my parents had spent thousands of dollars on his education, trips, and indulgences, while they barely saved enough to cover my basic college tuition. My brother tried to defend himself, saying, "I didn't know they were using her money, but for me that wasn't an excuse." "It doesn't matter if you knew or not," I replied. "What matters is that your whole life, you've accepted privileges without ever questioning where they came from, and now we're all paying the price." His regret was clear, but I couldn't let that change my stance. I had to stay firm to ensure they never got away with this again. With my aunt's help, we managed to secure a court order for my parents to return part of the money they had misused. It wasn't a large sum, but it was enough to show that their actions had consequences. More importantly, the order prohibited them from handling any funds related to me in the future. From that point on, my aunt became my legal financial guardian, until I turned 21, meaning my parents no longer had control over me or my future. On the other hand, the social fallout for my parents was devastating. When my other uncles and cousins found out everything that had happened, many of them cut ties with my parents. My mom tried to explain to some of them that it was all a misunderstanding, but no one believed her. On the other hand, my dad fell into a deep silence, unable to face the reality of the situation. My brother also faced consequences, though to a lesser degree. While he had started changing his attitude and taking on more responsibility, the truth about how he had been the favored child for so long damaged his reputation with both his friends and family. For me, this wasn't about getting back at them, but about seeking justice. I wanted my parents to truly understand the impact of their actions and to realize that they could never treat me or anyone else that way again. A few weeks after everything had come to light, I received a letter from my mom. It was the first time she reached out to me after I had blocked her calls. In the letter, she apologized, saying that she never fully understood how much they had hurt me. She claimed that now, after losing the respect of everyone around them, she finally grasped what I had felt all those years. For a moment, I thought about responding, but ultimately, I decided not to. Her words, though they seemed genuine, came too late. I wasn't ready to forgive her, and I wasn't even sure I ever would. Meanwhile, my life continued. My aunt helped. me enroll in college, and with the funds we had recovered, I didn't have to worry about any expenses. I also landed a part-time job, which gave me a sense of independence I had never experienced before. My relationship with my aunt blossomed as we became a family by choice, leaving behind the pain we had endured together. As for my parents, I heard through other relatives that they were still struggling to rebuild their social lives, but I didn't care anymore. They had made their decisions, and I had made mine. One day, my aunt and I decided to do something symbolic to close this chapter. While packing my belongings from my parents' house, I came across some old photos. They were family, pictures, but in every one of them, I had been pushed to the background, like an observer in my own life. We decided to burn the photos, not out of hatred, but as an act of liberation. Watching the flames consume those images, I felt like I was leaving behind years of pain and bitterness. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the next story.